Hello, my noble band of outlaws. Outlaw Samurai coming at you live with a video. Well, today we are going to do the review of this. The 1796 Light Cavalry Sabre. And as always, I'm going to start with the description. Measurements and comparing measurements. Now, before I begin, I generally give about a quarter inch of wiggle room in comparing the measurements. Basically, I can understand a few slight differences, but not major ones. Let's begin. This saber was widely used by the British and their Persian allies under General Blücher, that is an actual name apparently, in the Battle of Waterloo. The blade was derived from the furious Indian tulwar and was reviled by the French, who protested its use due to its horribly destructive wounds it inflicted. And if you watch the cutting video, I made a comparison between how the Nazis complained about the American trench sweeper shotgun, and I said that this was the first melee weapon by that very definition to commit war crimes. And that's the thing. Now, to be quite clear, I say Nazis because it is the actual political term. And I know that and this is something that a lot of people don't want to admit, that in 1940s Germany, not everyone was Nazi, okay? You had the Nazi Party, and then you had ordinary Germans. And the ordinary Germans were fed propaganda by the Nazis in order for them to come to power, and the ones that didn't agree with the ideology either kind of kept their heads low as to protect themselves and their families and stay alive, or they secretly helped the anti-Nazi war efforts and worked with the Allies to defeat them. So, just by that, the Nazis tried to claim that the trench sweeper shotgun was too gory, too violent, and they would execute anyone who's on site who was using one. Well, Germany, you kind of don't get to complain about war crimes when you're the guys who invented mustard gas. Well, I shouldn't say Germany, I should say Nazis. Nazis, you really don't get to complain when you're the ones that created mustard gas. So, kind of reap what you sow there. In fact, this saber was so successful as a cutting weapon that the German cavalry continued to use it right up to the beginning of the 20th century, aka right up until World War I and through World War II. Features a sharpened high-carbon steel blade with steel hilt and leather-wrapped grip, including a matching leather scabbard with steel fittings. Now, they do have a solid steel version of the scabbard, but I chose leather simply because leather won't dull your sword nearly as much as a steel scabbard would do, and in this case, if you draw this sword correctly, you won't have to worry about it dulling either the main or false edge, because I can get it in and out without the edges ever touching the metal shape. And I'll make a video about that later on. The price for this sword is $248.95, with the sizzle payment plan that comes out to $70 after shipping and everything. Depends on where you are in the world or where you are in the continental United States. The specifications of this sword is 37.5 inches overall length, 31.5 inch blade, 2 pounds 3.6 ounces, width 35 millimeters, and that the width they're talking about is where the belly of this blade, where the belly of the cutting edge begins and then tapers into the tip. 7 millimeters to 2.9 millimeters, which historically had a thickness of about 8 millimeters to and could taper down to less than 1 millimeter at the very tip. Nut construction for the pommel, which obviously is incorrect. This is peened, not nut construction, but I guess they kind of just lumped cold steel in. All cold steel swords have nut construction because 90% of their swords do that aren't katana. Grip length is 3 7/8 inches. Blade is 1055 high carbon steel, cold steel's bread and butter. Type is Sabre, class battle ready, manufacturer cold steel, and country of origin India. Which, if I could say something real quick, the fact that this is a British sword patterned in 1796, late 17th century, beginning of the early 18th century, where India was actually a part of the British Empire, it actually makes historical sense for this sword to come from India, because historically, Britain did outsource a lot of their weapons from their quote-unquote empire, especially India. And since this sword is modeled after the Indian Talwar, it just makes even more historical sense for this sword to have been made in India and then shipped over to America, who beat the bloody British in 1776, bitches! America! What you gonna do? But in any case, I digress. Now, I should make a confession. This is the second time I had to make this video, because the first time I ran out of storage space. But I am going to basically repeat what I said in somewhat same order, so I don't get confused out the hell. Now, let us begin. As we always do, we will start with length. We will start with length, thicknesses, and then move down to weight, and then my thoughts. So, get the tape measure there. Overall length of this sword is actually 37 3/4 of an inch. So it's a 1/4 inch longer than the specs on Colt of Athena. And since these swords are handmade, you have to have some wiggle room in terms of their lengths. Blade length is 31.5 inches. Mine clocks in at 32.5 inches. And that extra inch in a sword fight can make all the difference. I know that sounds like something else, but trust me. When it comes to weapons-based martial arts, the length of your weapon is a very large and imposing and determining factor in who's going to win the fight. That's why the spear is considered the king of the battlefield and not the sword. So, mine is slightly longer than the standard, than Colt of Athena's specifications measurements. There we go. Next, we will move on to the grip length. Grip length is supposed to be 3 7/8 of an inch. I will be measuring the grip length on this sword from the bottom of the crossguard to where the knuckle guard, or the knuckle bow, terms are interchangeable, meets the pommel, or in this case, the pommel cap. And my grip length is 4.5 inches. So I want to say that's almost half an inch longer than what is said on here. So, good for me because I have extra large hands. Next, we'll go to filthy non-American millimeter measurements. that out. As I was saying before, it is 35 millimeters right where the belly of the blade widens and then thins back out into the tip. Next, measurements down here along the blade. At the very base of the sword, we have a measurement of 7. First time I measured. First time I measured this, it was 7.9. Yep, there it is. Right. So, it is actually 7.7 millimeters. I must have bumped the calibers when I was pulling it up. But it is 0.7 millimeters thicker than what Cult of Athena says, but also not as thick as it was historically. However, just because the standard was 8 millimeters doesn't mean that all of these swords were 8 millimeters back in the day. Some were thicker, some were thinner. And I find that this is an acceptable margin of error. A couple of errant, needless swipes on a grinder will definitely put you in that ballpark. Which transferred over to inches is 0.30 inches, so almost 3/4 of an inch thick. Then we just hit where it tapers down to 5.2 millimeters, or slightly, or 0.05 less than 1/4 of an inch. Here it tapers to 4 millimeters, or much better American, 8.18 of an inch. Go up the blade. Weird. Four 4.7, 4.5, 4.2, 4. Okay, that's exactly 4 millimeters, or 0.16 of an inch. And we come up here, 3.8 millimeters, or 15th of an inch. So roughly, I don't know what that would translate to measurements on a tape measure. 3.6 millimeters, right where the false edge begins, or 0.14 of an inch. And then all the way at the tippy tip is 2.5 millimeters, or 0.10 of an inch. So it does have the historical distal taper that its olden day counterparts had, or the originals. Next, we will go on to weight. The final measurement for this sword, and I will be taking about an ounce off of the weight of this sword because I did add these paracord tassels. 2 pounds. And its highest, it says 3.9 ounces. So I'm going to take an ounce off and say it's 2 pounds, 3.8 ounces, which is 2 ounces heavier than what Cult of Athena has on the website. And as I believe I mentioned before, I find it very historically accurate that this sword, inspired by an Indian weapon, is then made in India in the British pattern, which were a part of the British Empire in the 18th century, and subsequently was used by the British in the 18th century to fight their wars. Now that we've compared the measurements and we've compared the weights and found everything out, it's time for my thoughts on this sword. And my thoughts are that, if I'm being honest, I really can't call this a replica. For all historical accounts and for all measurements taken, I cannot say that this is a replica of a 1796 light cavalry saber. This is a 1796 light cavalry saber, just made with modern materials. Cold Steel took the pattern, the actual paper pattern that was written down and sent out to the blacksmiths of the era, and copied it and made this. It is, in my opinion, a literal modern day 1796 light cavalry saber, just made in the modern day. They even got the ribbing that on the grip right, because historically the ribbing here actually goes all the way down the grip, even through the languettes. So I cannot say that this isn't historically accurate in its place of origin, its design, everything. Even the weight and probably how it handles. If I was to pick up an original model from back in the day and compare them side by side, I generally feel like there would not be that big of a difference. Now, as for cutting, I do have to say that this sword is a different beast. I have to get used to it. Just the act of having to get closer than what I'm accustomed to deliver the same kind of cuts that I'm used to delivering, just makes it a different beast. And that false edge at the end is just like, the false edge to me is more of just like a precision thing. Like, it's there so you can train your precision with your cuts, because it's not very long and it's not very big, as in it doesn't really have a lot of present, I don't want to say, behind it. Like, the weight of this sword is definitely forward heavy, and trying to cut with the false edge, your weight is off a little bit. But it is more of a precision thing. Like, if you can cut a bottle in half with the false edge, you should have no problem cutting bottles all day long with the main edge. Handling, as I said in the cutting video, it's weird. When you hold it normal, the weight sits in your hand like this. But the second you let that sword out, you feel the weight pull the blade down, especially in this area where your index finger rests. Now, there is the classic technique of wrapping your finger around the blade's guard to give you added control. And you don't need to worry about cutting yourself because this section of the blade is completely blunt. It only gets sharp from here upwards. Which is kind of what you want because this is where you do most of your parrying and most of your blocks with a saber. So this don't need to be sharp. This up here needs to be sharp. So you could easily wrap your finger around the guard and not have to worry about cutting the ligaments in it. Now, as for the classic thumb up the back strap, which is this metal part on the back of the grip, you can do that too. I did not attempt it during the cutting video, simply because I was gripping this more like I would traditionally grip my normal swords, which are the two-handed ones, because I wanted to ensure that I had the best possible edge alignment to deliver good cuts. I may try Sabre grip once I've put a better edge on this. The edge is there, most definitely, but I feel like it just needs a little touch up and it'll be right at that bottle popping sharpness that we all love in the backyard cutting community. If I was going to go into a sword fight, I would leave the edge as is because it's more robust as it is. But I'm not going into a sword fight. I'd want a more robust edge. You can always stab a motherfucker with a sword. It's a pointy piece of metal that will go through somebody. Which basically are what Renaissance longswords were made for. They were made to bust apart chainmail, but I digress. Overall, I really do believe that if you're going to get into sabers, this isn't a bad one to add to your collection. It doesn't break the bank. It is historically accurate from all that I can tell. And I really have nothing to say against it except that I feel it could be just a bit sharper. The grip is comfortable and it fits my hand, and this is usually why I buy cold steel weapons in general. That is because the grips accommodate large hands. There's nothing worse than getting a new sword that you absolutely love, but the moment you grip it, it just feels wrong. This feels good to me. I will say that the languettes on the grip, these metal bits right here, they do jut out. I would like to see them more recessed or ground flat, because they dig into your hand, but it's nothing really uncomfortable. If you use katana and you're used to wrapping your fingers around manuki, it's pretty much like that. They're there, but they don't really cause any true discomfort for me. But it is worth mentioning that they are there, they do jut out, and you will feel some discomfort while using them. Now, if we take a look at where the blade meets the guard, I feel this is where this sword would shine for a lot of people, in the fact that there isn't really any gap in the sword guard where the blade meets. There's no real gap there. The blade, if anything, the blade juts out over the guard. In all honesty, the blade is actually wider than the guard's slot for it. Which is a good thing, because the blade then can act as its own shoulders. And the way this is actually constructed is the guard is separate. The backstrap, the guard, the backstrap, and the grip section are all separate. Guard is put on, grip and backstrap are put on. Guard is then slit into this slot here, aligned with the tang. Or is it guard, grip, then backstrap? One of those combinations, and then peened. Now, historical versions of these swords don't actually have this peen block here. They're actually sanded flush. Personally, I like the peen block being there. It's kind of an aesthetic thing. I would prefer to hang my traditional two-sided tassels actually from the peen block. I like it. It adds a bit of character to the sword, in my opinion. Now, I really can't say much more about this, other than that I would say it's worth the money that you pay. And the only real negative to me are these languettes here on the grip. That's it. That is really the only negative I can say about the sword. The sword. We spent all this time just with the sword, but we're neglecting that there is a scabbard. Now, some people will say, "Oh, I'm buying a saber. I should get a belt. I should get the belt system that goes along with it." Well, yes and no. If you are buying a saber for more money, then yes. But for sub $300, even sub $280, the fact that you're getting a sword and a scabbard at all, and it's not a katana, I feel you should be happy with. Now, as we can see, I kind of just made a quick suspension system out of paracord after fiddling around with it for a day or two. As we can see, the sword has basically all the same metal fittings that would be on the metal scabbard, except that in between the metal fittings, it's leather and not steel. Now, when I first got this sword, it had great retention. It didn't fall out and was easy to pull out. But now, it doesn't. And it's because somewhere along the making process, this was not secured correctly. These are the little plastic liners that are inside Cold Steel's leather sword scabbards that act as retention. Well, they didn't even peel the sticky backing off of these squares before putting them into the scabbard. So, yeah, that's the reason why this no longer has the retention that it had beforehand. Now, it still has enough retention from the languettes to make that locking sound. So what I'm probably going to end up having to do is take some paracord, just wrap it around this metal shape, and then use the paracord as like a friction fit solution to keep this in place. But other than that little nuance, I don't really have much to say about the scabbard either. It does what it's supposed to. It protects the blade. It protects you from getting cut by the blade. It allows you to transport the blade. It's a simple leather scabbard with good stitching along the back. It has thick, robust hanging loops. And all these loops are, all these fittings are screwed in place. So that's a plus. All of them have mechanical connections keeping them in place. So overall, what do I think of this sword? I think that it is a very good sword for a beginner that's just trying to get their feet wet in using sabers. I really wouldn't recommend getting like a US model cavalry saber or later period sabers, simply because of the fact that they are an even more different beast than this. This is similar to, if anyone out there, if any of you have Indian swords already, like an Indian tulwar or even slightly larger katanas, this is something you could be more accustomed to, and really wouldn't have to struggle so much with changing how you do your cuts. Especially if you already have the Indian tulwar, which this thing was based off of. Or if you have a deeply curved katana and you're good at doing one-handed cuts with it, I really don't think you'd have to change your style too much to accommodate it. So it's definitely a beginner's saber. It's not something I would recommend just to a more immediate saber master. But I would recommend this for a beginner who's looking to get their feet wet. And you saw that I did do some slight abusive cutting with this towards the end of the cutting video, where I lopped into carpet rolls, and those things are no joke. The only sword I have that I could confidently say has cut through one of them is the Warrior O, which is roughly the same thickness at the bottom of this thing, but thicker. It's like I think it's almost double the thickness of this sword throughout. But that thing's a workhorse that will cut through anything. This is also a workhorse as well. It is a beater. Alright, Cold Steel is famous for making beater swords. Swords that are tough, strong, resilient, that can take up beating and keep on slashing. This is no exception to their formula. People say Cold Steel is overbuilt. I say Cold Steel is really for those who want to basically cut things that you shouldn't normally try to cut. Or for dumb rednecks like myself that try to cut down trees with their swords. But yeah, I highly do recommend picking one of these up if you want to begin your journey into using sabers. Just know that you'll need to touch up the edge a little bit. Maybe file down these languettes if they bother you. And get accustomed. And also I would suggest maybe bulking up whatever arm you're probably going to be doing the predominance of your cutting with, because this sword actually tires out my arms faster than I thought it would, and I think it's mainly because it's a single-handed sword. But yeah, not too many downsides. The pros definitely outweigh the cons with this sword, and it's historically accurate to a degree. So until next time, my noble band of outlaws, Outlaw Samurai tells all y'all be crazy rednecks, be safe and use your weapons. Hope you found this video informative, and I'm out. Peace. Though before I go, watch closely. You just simply put the tip in the very middle of the chape and slowly push it until the false edge is cleared the chape opening, and then you can just push on the back of the spine like you would a normal katana or curved sword. And that's how you sheath this thing without dulling the hell out of it. And then just pull it out flat. The edges will never touch this chain. Though it appears you could also file it down to some extent if it really bothers you or you're really worried about dulling the hell out of your blade. So, I'm out. Peace.